Hello, I'm Jeanette Littlemore and I'm a Professor of English Language and Applied Linguistics at the University of Birmingham. I work on metaphor and other kinds of figurative language, but what I focus on is metaphor in everyday communication, so not necessarily poetry and literature, but just in the way people communicate much more generally. One thing that I've noticed in the way in which people communicate about COVID-19 is that people use a lot of metaphors when they're talking about progress towards recovery, the progress with the vaccine. And one person who particularly likes to use a lot of metaphors, particularly football metaphors, is Jonathan Van Tam. So he'll talk about things like tracking back or winning the hard yards or looking at what the defence is doing as well as the attack and not focusing primarily on the attack. One of the good things about his use of metaphor here is it focuses on the team effort and how it's not just about the people who grab the limelight and the people who make the big discoveries, how we're all working together. So there's a couple of reasons why metaphor works really well in this kind of context. One is that metaphor's been shown to trigger emotional responses in the brain. So it triggers a part of the brain called the amygdala, which is responsible for processing emotion and reasoning and linking the two. So therefore it's really quite impactful. The other reason why metaphor is very effective is that it also triggers what's called the motor sensory cortex. So that is basically part of the brain that's responsible for processing motion and also feelings of the senses. So if, say, for example, you hear about something being sweet, metaphorically, that will trigger a response that's similar to if you're actually tasting something that's sweet. So there's not that much distinction between the literal and the metaphorical in terms of the brain response to language. And so when you hear about things like, I don't know, for example, we're in the last lap of the race, it's almost as if you mentally simulate yourself being in a race, so it has a kind of effect on the way in which you process your understanding of the progress towards the virus. Some people say that you shouldn't mix metaphors. That's something we all learn in school, that you're not supposed to mix your metaphors. But if you listen to the way people actually use metaphor, we mix them all the time. And that's not a bad thing. That's quite often a good thing, because the thing about a metaphor is it won't give you the whole picture. It'll only give you kind of like one angle on the story. And in order to get the whole picture, you will often need to bring together 2 or 3 metaphors. So if you listen to the way in which people talk about the government response to COVID, we have football metaphors, but we'll also have racing metaphors, particularly, for example, when the Grand National was on, we had a lot of racing metaphors. And then also you'll have things like very, very sort of straightforward, like things like the roadmap to recovery, and these kind of metaphors, all doing a slightly different job, but working together to create the message that needs to be conveyed. There's been some work into what kind of metaphors are likely to be most effective. Generally, creative metaphors are more effective than conventional metaphors, but there's a bit of a sweet spot where metaphor is concerned. So if you go too creative, then people just won't really understand what it is that you're saying. There needs to be something that people could kind of latch onto, which is why people often use very common kind of what are called source domains. So source domains would be things like the football or the racing, or the maps and the route planning, in order to describe things which are a bit more abstract. So people need to have a bit of a handle on it in order to get the creativity. Metaphors effective in communication more generally, outside politics, outside COVID. And one of the things that's been observed, that I've observed in my own research, but other people have observed this too, is that people use metaphor to express quite personal, quite complex emotional experiences, particularly if they're kind of negative experiences. And it tends to be the case that the more strongly felt the experience, the more creative the metaphor. So in one of the studies that we did looking at how people talked about stressful experiences in the workplace, we had a guy who talked about how he felt like he was running on a soapy conveyor belt with a great big, he said actually a bloody great big elastic band pulling him back while people threw sponges at him. And so there you've got this incredibly creative scenario, which is kind of based on the programme It's a Knockout or Je Sans Frontières, you know, where you're basically put in a ridiculous situation and you're being made to suffer. And this highly physical, highly kind of embodied, creative use of metaphor manages to convey the stress of his workplace situation far better than if it just said, I had a really hard time at work today. And to bring it back to COVID, last night Dominic Raab was talking about the need to open up quite slowly over the coming weeks, and he used the expression snatching defeat from the jaws of a relatively successful vaccine programme. So here he's taking a well-known metaphor, snatching victory from the jaws of defeat, and twisting it round and putting a little twist on it and using it quite creatively. And this is an example of something that would be probably a very successful, quite memorable metaphor. It sticks in your mind, and that's why we use it.